And up next, I am so excited to have Matt here. Thank you, Matt, for joining us today. Matt is the Cisco wireless CTO. His group has worldwide responsibility for Cisco's wireless thought leadership and through analyzing technology and industry trends and providing direction to the product and engineering teams. So welcome, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Hey, very glad to be here. It's looking forward to a chance to have the chat. And I just noticed I need to update my picture to show a few gray whiskers, but otherwise we're ready to get going.
Matt, we'll just blame that on the pandemic, right? That's how that works. Speaking of, how have you been through the pandemic? I mean, it's just such a crazy time for all of us. I know, most of us throughout the world have never experienced something like this. So how have you been through that?
It's a little bit different for me personally. I'm pretty much used to like some of the other folks on the call, like Chuck, I'm sure. I was traveling every other week, and so on and off the planes and going to different events. In fact, not that long ago, we would have been in person doing this event. So it's a change, but I will have to say that it's amazing that the networks really stood up for what I would say is a common term I think being used now is this new normal. The ability to work from home. I mean, you can see my background. I'm actually at my son's house today,
Oh,
and
nice.
and the broadband being able to stand up to it, the Wi-Fi being able to stand up to it. It's been able to keep us productive. From a Cisco standpoint, I think that we've done all right. The productivity has been high. We have capabilities of pushing enterprise into the home environment, or what we call enterprise anywhere.
Mhm.
And so I think from that standpoint, things have been continuing to operate, and I think it's good to see the recovery coming. I'll just say that time to see customers again, as opposed to digitally see them.
Absolutely. So do you think that those customers, do you think they're thinking differently about Wi-Fi now through the pandemic than prior to?
Absolutely. And I was talking a little bit about home. Um, going into the pandemic, we looked at some of the data. We had about 6% of the workforce working from home.
Mhm.
During the pandemic, we saw that exceed 50%. And
Oh,
going post-pandemic, we don't think it's going back. We expect that over 30% will continue to work from home. In fact, we've seen very large numbers. 66% of companies are saying at least 25% of their workforce will be working from home.
mhm.
And so what this means, if you're an IT administrator, is that, how do you push policy to the home? How do you provide that enterprise experience to the home? We're also seeing hybrid implementations where people expect to work a couple of days a week from home. And this is a change. I heard Chuck saying a little bit earlier, as we get into these types of architectures and as we start to do our enterprise work, how do we access those services in as efficient a way as we can? And we've seen this huge shift through the
Mhm.
pandemic to zero trust. I think it was starting pre-pandemic, but now you expect to be able to get right at your services, and you expect to get right at those services with the policy and capabilities that you would have if you were at work. So I think a lot is changed, and the new normal will not be the post normal. But the good news is the networks are stepping up.
Fantastic. So as you know, we've talked a little bit about how we see it now. In the past 2 decades, when wireless came to creation, what did you see as the turning point from Wi-Fi being a nice to have, a convenient thing, to a critical business function?
We like to say that the world's gone wireless first, and I think it makes a lot of sense because there's a lot of agility that's tied to that. We expect to connect to wireless wherever we are. And I would say that probably changed, a little more than a decade ago when we saw the advent of 11N. All of a sudden, we can start to do high density. People
Mhm.
started to eliminate all the connections that they had in the office, all the physical connections. It wasn't that long ago. I remember some of the design guides going back then. You would put in 2, 3 Ethernet ports per station to connect various devices that people would have. And what we see now is that these open office type environments, and you literally can work from anywhere, and you tend to move around, and it's much more of a collaborative environment, and it's really good for innovation and I think ideation. And what that means is that you're just always connected wherever you go, wherever you move, just not when you have to go to the conference room. So I think the high density capability and the throughput capabilities of 11N really started to make that shift, where we got to the point where Wi-Fi was the primary connection, as opposed to just a convenience or just a backup.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I know me personally, when when Wi-Fi's down, nothing happens. TV, I mean, nothing. And thinking about that on an enterprise scale, how significant that is. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars in some case when Wi-Fi goes down in productivity and in for employees, labor, production. I mean, that's a really significant thing for businesses. So, you know, the criticality of Wi-Fi is just tantamount to business function and business
Yeah.
productivity.
And you've probably seen some of the Cisco data. I think one of the other
Mhm.
big shifts that happened was the availability of public Wi-Fi. It really started to
Absolutely.
explode then, and it just got to the point where there wasn't a building you would go to where you didn't expect that you would be able to connect to Wi-Fi. I remember several years ago, I went to a big hotel chain conference, and they said the Wi-Fi was more important to customer satisfaction than even loyalty points. You know, when you start to get to the point where people are choosing the hotel they stay at based on the connectivity quality,
Mhm.
then you know it's endemic to people's lives.
It's interesting too because I think as we look at being in the pandemic, Wi-Fi, the connectivity piece for all of us has been so important. We've got kids who, you know, are doing school online, being able to connect. And so, to your point about that, Wi-Fi has just become an absolute necessity in our life. So, speaking of a necessity, Chuck alluded to this a little bit, talking about not just Wi-Fi but cellular. So we know we've heard that, you know, 5G is going to kill Wi-Fi, right? That's what it is. Wi-Fi goes away with 5G. Is that how that works,
Well, you
Matt?
know, you have to take. Oftentimes, when you hear statements like that, you have to understand where that statement is coming from. But we've done a lot of comparisons on this, and look, let's look at devices just right off the bat. Um, you take any 5G device, and guess what? It also has Wi-Fi, right? But if you take any Wi-Fi device, it doesn't necessarily have LTE or 5G. And so there's a whole plethora of devices out there that are on Wi-Fi, and they're on Wi-Fi really for cost reasons. You know, I was getting on a plane, of course, pre-pandemic, and I'll never forget it. I was sitting there, and this little kid came on. He must have been about 4 years old, and he's got this little device in his hand, little Game Boy or something, and he turns around, looks at his mom, and he goes, "Mom, is there Wi-Fi on the plane?" You know, and there was. Right now, that Game Boy, you know, it has to meet a certain cost point, and Wi-Fi chipsets meet that cost point.
Mhm.
So I don't anticipate it going away. In fact, we're seeing phenomenal growth. If you follow some of the data that comes out of the Cisco yearly report, we're crossing 400 million public Wi-Fi access networks around the
Wow.
world this year.
Wow.
400 million, right? So that has its own challenges. But look, Wi-Fi is not going away anytime soon. I would say what's really happening is that we need to have this capability to move seamlessly amongst the dominant stacks. And I think the dominant stacks are LTE progressing to 5G and Wi-Fi as they go into Wi-Fi 6 and 6E.
Mhm.
And for the progressive service providers that are out there, what we're seeing is that they're using both technologies because you want to use the technology that's most cost effective for the particular service or the application that you're applying it to. So both of these technologies are going to do very well. And I think both of these technologies are going to play an ongoing role in our life. You know, I often like to talk about the day in the life, right? When you get
Mhm.
up in the morning, what are you connected to? You're connected to Wi-Fi. You drive into work, what are you connected to? You go to LTE or 5G. You get to work, what do you connect to? You connect to LTE or 5G or Wi-Fi. When you go out to lunch, you go back into 5G. When you go into the restaurant, you got Wi-Fi again. You know, stadiums are using both Wi-Fi and 5G because they want to use all the spectrum to provide the best service. So look, these things, these things are going to continue. I think the most development when it comes to these two technologies is going to be how you implement heterogeneous networks seamlessly. And so we're
Mhm.
applying a lot of time and effort there.
So talk to us about that, like the convergence of private LTE CBRS, six Wi-Fi 6, 6E, and LTE. How do you see all of that converging and working together?
So we like to look at it what I call a loosely coupled model.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is that access networks are owned by different entities. So an access network might be a private implementation, an access network might be a public implementation. And these public and private implementations use different access technologies. So you can see Wi-Fi, you see CBRS, you see LTE, you see 5G. Chuck mentioned that there's other stacks out there that may be not as high bandwidth, like Bluetooth and things like that. So I think uh, I think what's going to happen here is that we're going to get better at policy, and we're going to be better at traffic steering. So what do I mean by that? Right now, if you connect to Wi-Fi, all of your devices are Wi-Fi first. So, and you may have seen this. You go into an airport, you connect to Wi-Fi, all of your services are going to go over Wi-Fi. And as soon as you lose Wi-Fi, then it'll go to LTE, then it'll go to 5G. And this has to do with the business dynamics and the cost dynamics. But we really can do a better job than that. And what we're seeing is this advent of technologies now that allow us to do both. Multipath technologies, for example,
Hmm.
where you want higher resiliency, you want higher reliability. I can give you some examples. When you pick up your iPhone and you talk to Siri, Siri's actually using both paths, and they're doing that for resiliency in order to provide the best experience. FaceTime uses both paths. If you look at what's going on with Google Android, they're implementing a protocol called Quick, and Quick is designed to use both paths. So what we want to do is we want to pull intelligence from the network so that we know the capability of the path where you're going to get that best experience, and then choose that path in order to accommodate the application requirements that you're running on the device. And so there's lots of changes that are happening in the industry to better do this, like segmentation of the device. We already see that on Samsung devices, for example. You have a work profile and a home profile. All
Hmm.
of this policy is going to come together, which is good, right? We've been kind of avoiding this policy thing, I think, for a long time because these worlds have been too separate.
Hmm.
But as they come together now, we can start to apply this policy. The fact that the technologies are overlapping are good because that means we can move amongst them. And because we can move amongst them, now we can do so intelligently. That's where we need to be, and I think that's where the industry is going.
Hmm. Interesting. And especially as more and more of the carriers offload the cellular to Wi-Fi, I think we're going to see an increase in that convergence and an increase in working together. To your point, Matt, of all of those technologies together.
Yeah, and let me just make a comment on that.
Hmm.
People tend to think about this as very one way.
Hmm.
That the carrier would want to offload into venues or into enterprise networks
Hmm.
and extend that experience indoors. And that's been around for quite some time. But we should think about it both ways, because when I talk about policy, I talk about convergence between enterprise and service provider. And so if you're an enterprise, and given that you want to have enterprise capability anywhere at home or when you're out in the hotel, and you want to have the same policy, you want access to the same services, you're not going to keep VPNing back into work. You're going to be accessing these services from through zero trust access for the best experience. So what does it mean? That means you want to be able to push policy from the enterprise domain out into the service provider domain. So you can imagine, for example, we use Cisco Umbrella to protect us when we're doing DNS lookups and to provide security. When I'm out on a carrier network, why
Hmm.
not push that policy into that carrier network and provide that same Cisco Umbrella service to me when I'm off net that I would have when I'm on net? So it's these types of services that are bi-directional that I think drive
Hmm.
some of this convergence.
That's interesting, especially as you talk about hybrid workplaces and some of the things that are happening. It'll be really interesting to see how that works together in the next year or so as we continue moving in that direction. So thinking about, let's switch gears for a second. So thinking about network performance, what do you see is the biggest challenge to having reliable network performance, just in general?
So I tend to break this down into two arenas.
Hmm.
There's the capability of the stack, So like your Wi-Fi stack or your
Hmm.
LTE or 5G stack. And then there's the ability to protect for interference, collisions, rogues, the ability to manage. I don't know that Wi-Fi 6 was a dramatic change from Wi-Fi 5. We've got OFDMA. The network can now schedule devices. Because of that, we can control the division. We can actually schedule in the frequency domain, and we can control the ability to have very high density of devices on the network, and do so with very good latency characteristics. Now, the problem you start running into when you're in unlicensed technologies is that someone else can use that spectrum. In fact, someone mobile could use that spectrum and could come into your environment and change that characteristic. And that's what I call protecting for that interference domain. And that's why we do all this technology around radio resource management and rogue mitigation and all those capabilities. That's why it's so important, for example, to understand your RF environment. I mean, that's why we're using Ekahau tools when we're provisioning these things to understand that environment so that we can do proper design. Those things become absolutely critical. But again, if you can schedule your medium a la wireless, and you can protect in the interference domain, then you can produce an environment that's very deterministic and very reliable. So those are the two areas where we spend most, frankly, of our time.
Hmm. Interesting. So let's talk about a little, we talked about CBRS, we've talked about LTE, and the convergence of those, but let's specifically look at the advancements of 6 gigahertz and beyond that. So what do you see as the next big advancement for Wi-Fi beyond 6 gigahertz?
So, so look, I think we're on the right track.
Hmm.
If you look at 6 gigahertz, we've at some level we've freed ourselves from legacy, and I almost hate to say that because people will take it wrong. Because one of the beautiful things of Wi-Fi is that it's very backward compatible. But as we go into 6 gigahertz, we go into it with Wi-Fi 6. And so these two concerns that I was talking about, the capability to schedule the stack, if you're scheduling the stack using something like Wi-Fi 6 and you got a bunch of Wi-Fi 5 or 4 devices that are also connecting into that space, then you got to contend with scheduling and these other devices just jumping on the network, and you're not going to get that deterministic result. And I think, as you go into 6 gigahertz, that's what's enabling you to protect that frequency domain. So now that we can do those things, what's going to happen is we're going to see, I think, extreme advances in OFDMA. What are those scheduling algorithms? How do you take those scheduling algorithms and connect them to your upper stack? So if you have mission critical applications, think of hospitals, for example, or think of a robot arm in a manufacturing plant. That traffic has very low latency. It has to be addressed first. So if you can take your upper stack policy and apply it to your Wi-Fi stack OFDMA scheduling, right, and then you can protect for interference in your interference domain, then you're into that next level. I heard Chuck mention Wi-Fi 7, and we are looking forward to some of the things that are coming there, things like multi-link operation, for example, and the ability to connect to multiple APs simultaneously. Because all these things that I'm talking about around latency, and I agree with Chuck, it's not so much a throughput problem now. It's more about determinism and reliability and latency for this new set of applications. You need to be able to do that even while you're mobile. So what's going to happen is that we're going to get much better at going AP to AP. We're going to be able to do these hitless transitions as you move across the network. And that's going to enable these new really hungry applications like AR/VR. It's going to enable robots to be running around delivering your mail. All those types of things where you need that next level of reliability. So we're on track for that next generation. And I think that we're continuing down that path as we see some of the enhancements going into Wi-Fi 7 as well.
So thinking about the individuals on our audience, we have a technical audience. We've got solutions architects, we've got wireless engineers and leaders, leadership in all of the organizations, whether they're partners, customers, or partners, end users, network owners. What do you think is the biggest takeaway for our audience to be able to communicate to a non-technical audience about the importance of 6 gigahertz upgrades and, investment into network upgrades?
So I think Chuck touched a little bit on the economic value, and if you look at the WFA, the capabilities or the countrywide even impact economically, I think is really huge. But if I take a step back and I look at the applications that are currently out there and how humans relate, interact, that's getting better and better. I mean, if you go back several years, the killer app was kind of voice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And voice was hard to do because humans have to interact in a certain timing, or we're talking over each other, so delay becomes important. And what we've done is we've moved into these rich collaboration experiences, like what we're doing right now. I mean, I have a video stream and talking to you. We can see the picture up there. People are commenting and on the chat at the same time. And so that's a richer experience, and that has certain delay characteristics. And I think the next level that's starting to happen, and I really do think that this is starting to happen, is what I would call digital immersion. And we've seen that in AR, for example. People probably saw that the U.S. Army just bought over $20 billion worth of VR headsets from Microsoft. I mean, this stuff is starting to happen. We've seen some of the startup companies that are offering these new AR glasses, and what we're seeing now is that all the big dogs are starting to announce that they're going to have things in the 2022 timeframe. And so just think about some of the changes that really will bring about. Now, if we look at those types of applications in this digital immersion, this stuff I think will be actually pretty. I'll actually use the word addictive. I mean, we've gotten addicted to our smartphones, right? And as you have glasses on like this, and you're able to pull up data at any time, you meet someone, it brings up their name, it tells you the last time you talked to them and what you talked to them about. The ability to customize your experience in your environment. Instead of having my 4 screens on my desk, I can pull up a virtual screen and I can work from that virtual screen anywhere. That's going to drive new requirements into the network. How is it that you can have something very light, like a pair of glasses like this, not these giant headsets, mm-hmm. And make it last all day in a battery? Well, that's another shift that we're seeing in the industry. We're seeing this concept of remote rendering. Microsoft is doing it, NVIDIA is doing it, AMD is doing it. And so what you're going to do is you're going to have these rendering engines that are doing all the compute and the render away from the glasses. Well, what does it mean? Huge, huge, huge demand on the network, right? I mean, we've seen the demand on the network doing what we're doing now in collab, and think about what COVID has done, and we're all using collab now, and think about the burst that had on the networks, and we've seen some of the numbers and the increases. Now think about getting into these types of environments and the amount of traffic that's going to drive. So that's why we're working on these next generation technologies. That's why we're working on the ability to do reliable networking, determinism, low latency type applications, because that's where this is all going. And so that digital immersion, that conversion between the analog world that humans operate in and the digital information world that can always be available to you, those are the types of transitions that are happening. So if you want to know why 6 gigahertz and things like Wi-Fi 6 and as we go into 7 are important, that's why, because those are the first steps. That's the technology that can carry this next set of applications.
Fantastic. Well, I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. Matt, thank you for joining. But before we end, any final thoughts for folks on, thinking about how important design is, thinking about network upgrades, and thinking about the technology convergence? Any final thoughts on those points?
So look, I often say that wireless is the final frontier, and and I'm going to say something very obvious to this crew, because this crew is of course very technical, but wireless is not a cable. And I mean, I think that's just putting it mildly. Even at Cisco, you have switching engineers and you have networking engineers, and they all kind of they all kind of fall into a bucket, and they can work on routers, they can work on switches, they can work on SD-WAN. But then you get into wireless, And that is just a different science. I mean, dealing with wireless and understanding the RF characteristics and making sure that you can do clean design. I mean, again, this is why Ekahau is in such a sweet spot. If you can't understand the RF, if you can't understand what's going on in your environment, then you can't get to this next generation of applications and services. And in fact, even as we develop the next technologies, the visibility that Ekahau gives us into that realm so that we better understand what we have to deal with, right? And the collaboration that we have with companies like Ekahau in order to make that better, that's just fundamental to taking us into the future. So look, wireless is the future. People are not connecting to cables anymore. It is the last frontier, and it's a different beast. And we need that type of visibility in order to do it right.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. We appreciate that. And we like to think here at Ekahau we're in a good position as well, because we have, as you guys are going to hear from Ari and Ansi